People spend their whole lives being sorted into two categories by the people who love them most, useful and not. And most of us never once stop to ask whether we came by that sorting honestly. I was standing in the vestibule of First Baptist Church on Bardstown Road at 9:40 in the morning, 4 days after my father died, reading a single sheet of funeral programs stacked on a folding table. And the name printed under the photograph wasn't the name I'd called him for 45 years. It said Vincent Alden Danforth, not Al, not Dad. A name I knew from somewhere else entirely, a name I'd been staring at for 2 decades without once connecting it to the man who raised me. I stood in that vestibule doing arithmetic I didn't want to be doing at my own father's funeral. On a morning that should have belonged only to grief and instead belonged, at least for those first few minutes, to a much colder kind of accounting. I spent my whole life calling my father useless, in private and eventually in print. And I let the people around me believe it too, and I never once, not a single time in 45 years, asked him a real question about who he actually was before I decided what he wasn't. My name is Joanna Whitcomb. I go by Jo. I'm 45, I live outside Nashville now, and I've spent the last 22 years as a singer-songwriter, 3 studio albums, one song most people would recognize if I hummed 4 bars of it, and a reputation, which my publicist built carefully, and which I never once corrected, for being entirely self-made. Whitcomb isn't the name I was born with. I'll get to that. I've told parts of this story before, to a therapist I saw for about a year after the funeral, to my husband, who never met my father and only knows him through the version of events I'm giving you now, and each time I tell it, I notice myself wanting to rush past the ordinary, unremarkable cruelty of the middle and get straight to the part in the church vestibule where everything supposedly changed. I'm not going to do that here. Let me back up, though, because none of this will make sense unless you understand exactly who my father was before I spent my whole life narrating him as somebody smaller than that. My father tuned pianos for a living out of a storefront on Frankfort Avenue in Louisville that he rented for 31 years, and before that, out of the trunk of a succession of increasingly unreliable station wagons. He learned the trade from a man named Otis Renfro, who ran the shop before him, taking it over in his mid-20s for almost nothing down. A handshake and a promissory note he paid off within 3 years, and he could hear a piano go flat from another room, mid-conversation, and stop talking to go fix it, without ever seeming to notice he'd interrupted himself. He carried a tuning fork in his shirt pocket every single day of his working life, a worn brass one, A440, that he'd had since before I was born. A gift from Otis Renfro on his last day at the shop, and he'd tap it against his knee out of habit the way other men jingle car keys. He used to sit down at any piano in any room, ours, a stranger's, a church basement, and play the first 8 bars of a melody he never finished. Always the same 8 bars, and when I asked him about it as a kid he'd say, "Someday I'll finish that one," in a tone that made it sound like a chore he was putting off rather than anything that mattered, and I believed him about that for most of my life, the way I believed him about most things, which is to say not very carefully. He had a saying he used on me more than once, usually standing over an open piano with his tools laid out on a felt cloth, that a piano's only out of tune if nobody's willing to listen closely enough, which he meant literally about strings and hammers and the tiny drift a piano does over a season of humidity, and which I understood, decades later, was also the only thing he ever really tried to tell me about people. For over 20 years, he tuned the piano and the old upright organ at First Baptist for free, and he did the same for the music room at Bellwood Elementary, 2 blocks from our old house, never billing either of them. A fact I only half registered as a kid, because it seemed like just another one of his unpaid, slightly aimless commitments. The kind of thing that fit the general shape of a man who couldn't seem to keep a full schedule of paying customers, even though, looking back now, his appointment book was never actually empty. He simply spent a certain number of those hours every month on instruments that would never write him a check. My parents divorced when I was 7. Over reasons that were never fully explained to me at the time, and that I only partly understand now. Money, mostly, my mother has told me since, and a restlessness in my father that she said she couldn't live inside anymore, though she's also told me, more recently, that she sometimes wonders whether restlessness was ever the right word for a man who never actually went anywhere, who stayed in the same 3-mile radius of that city for the rest of his life, tuning the same pianos, showing up to the same church on the same Sundays. My mother remarried 3 years later to an orthodontist named Greg Whitcomb, who wore his success the way some men wear cologne, a little too much of it, applied a little too deliberately. And by the time I was 12, I'd taken his last name legally, a decision my mother framed to me as practical. School records, consistency. A family that matched on paper, and which I now understand, with the clarity you only get from a great deal of distance, was also the first real vote I ever cast in favor of the version of my life that didn't include my father. Cast when I was 12 years old and too young to understand what a vote like that actually costs. There's a specific memory from when I was maybe 10, not long after the divorce, of a family 2 doors down from my father's shop, the Ellisons, whose son had some kind of undiagnosed hearing trouble that made him hit piano keys too hard. Hard enough that other teachers had asked them to find lessons elsewhere. My father took the boy on for free, on Saturday mornings for almost 2 years, adjusting his own teaching around a kid nobody else wanted the trouble of, and I only knew about it because I sometimes had to wait in the shop while he finished, bored, swinging my legs off a stool, resenting every single one of those Saturday mornings for cutting into whatever I'd rather have been doing. I didn't think of it as generosity at the time. I thought of it as one more example of my father being unable to say no to people who couldn't pay him, which in my mother and Greg's house had already calcified into a kind of shorthand for why he'd never gotten anywhere. Not talent, not luck, just an inability to charge what he was worth, framed to me over and over as a character flaw rather than what it actually was. I should say, honestly, that my resentment of him wasn't invented out of nothing, and I don't want to make him sound like a man I simply failed to appreciate for no reason. He was late to things. He showed up to my 5th grade winter concert 40 minutes after it started, in his work clothes, smelling like machine oil, and sat in the very back row where I could still see him, mortified, certain every kid around me had noticed. He forgot, more than once, to pick me up on the right day from the right place, and I'd sit on a curb outside a friend's house for 20 or 30 minutes, doing the math on whether he'd simply forgotten me entirely. Money was unpredictable in a way that made me anxious even as a small child. Some months there was extra for a school trip, other months there wasn't enough for new shoes. And I never once, growing up, felt like I could predict which kind of month I was standing in. All of that is true, and none of it required me to spend the rest of my adult life reducing an entire complicated man down to a single word. Greg never said a cruel word about my father directly, not once, not that I can point to. What he did instead, patiently, over about a decade of Sunday dinners, was let a certain tone settle over any mention of Al Danforth, a small, tolerant smile, a bless his heart delivered with just enough weight to do its work. A running joke about my father's station wagon that outlived 3 engines because he refused to buy a car with a payment attached to it. I absorbed that tone completely. I made it my own. By the time I was in high school, I could do Greg's exact expression myself, unprompted, whenever my father's name came up around my new friends, and nobody in that house ever had to ask me to be disloyal to my own father. I volunteered for it, over and over, because it was the fastest way I knew to belong to the family that seemed to be winning. When I was 11, my father offered to teach me piano himself, on the shop's demo upright, free lessons on Saturday mornings, the same offer he'd made the Ellison boy years earlier. I went twice. On the third Saturday, Greg had already arranged, without asking me first, for a proper teacher. A woman named Mrs. Petrakis, who charged $40 an hour and taught out of a converted sunroom in a nicer part of town, and my mother framed it to me as an upgrade, a real opportunity. The kind of structured instruction that would actually get me somewhere. I told my father I didn't need his lessons anymore because I had a real teacher now. I remember the exact look on his face when I said real, which I understood even at 11 was not a neutral word, and which he didn't correct me on, just nodded and said that sounded like a good opportunity, and never offered again. I found the record when I was 14, in a milk crate of my father's old vinyl he kept in the shop's back room, a battered 45 with a plain label. A song called Carolina Low, recorded by a woman named Wanda Shue on a label out of Lexington called Bluegrass Line Records, 1978. I played it on the shop's ancient turntable while my father was out at a house call, and something about it, the way the melody hesitated in exactly the places you expected it to resolve, undid me completely, in the specific. Total way only 14-year-olds get undone by songs. I played it probably 400 times that year. I never once looked closely enough at the composer credits stamped in small type near the spindle hole. R. Combs/V. Danforth, to register that the second name belonged to anyone but a stranger who happened to share it with half the county. By the time I was 23, I'd moved to Nashville, and I was building a career on exactly the kind of story labels like to sell. The girl who taught herself guitar off YouTube, no formal training, no family in the business, pure grit. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had taught myself a great deal. What the story left out, at the specific and repeated insistence of my manager, a sharp, kind woman named Deb Halloran, who believed in the narrative with total sincerity, was any mention of the 2 summers I spent at Bellwood Fine Arts Camp on what I'd always been told was a need-based community scholarship, or the years of private lessons at a rate my mother's household could not actually have afforded on its own, both of which I mentioned to almost no one. Not because I was hiding something I understood, but because they didn't fit the shape of the story Deb and I had agreed was more marketable. Deb Halloran and I had a specific conversation about this, early on, sitting in a booth at a diner off Music Row, while she read over a one-sheet a label intern had drafted for me. She circled the line about being self-taught and asked me directly whether there was anything more complicated underneath it, because reporters sometimes dig, and she'd rather know now than get surprised later. I told her about the camp, in general terms, framed as a scholarship. Nothing more. She thought about it for a second and said the scholarship detail was actually fine to leave out entirely. Nobody wants nuance in a bio, Joe. They want an arrow pointing straight up. And I remember agreeing with her immediately, with something close to relief, because it meant I didn't have to explain a piece of my childhood I'd never fully understood myself, and could instead let a simpler, cleaner story stand in for it. In March of 2011, a magazine called Six String Quarterly ran a profile of me timed to my second album, and the writer asked, gently, whether my father had been musical, whether that's where any of it came from. I remember exactly what I said, because I've had to sit with the exact wording of it more than once since. I said my father couldn't hold a job long enough to keep our own piano in tune, let alone teach me anything about music, and that whatever was in me, I'd built myself. It ran in print, exactly like that, a direct quote, attributed to me, and I did not ask the editor to change a word of it, because at the time it felt like the truest, funniest, most efficient way to describe a man who spent 31 years literally tuning other people's pianos for a living. He called me about that article. It was the only time in my adult life I remember him raising his voice on the phone, not loudly, just with an edge I'd never heard from him before. He asked if I'd really said that, about the piano. I told him it was just color for a story, that nobody takes those quotes that seriously, that he was being sensitive about nothing. "I've tuned 3,000 pianos in my life, Joe," he said, and I remember being surprised he had an exact number ready, like he'd done the math himself at some point, for reasons of his own. "I think I know how to keep one in tune." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "All right," and changed the subject to something about the Reds' bullpen. And I let him, relieved, because it was easier than sitting in the silence I'd actually put him in. The clearest moment, though, the one I keep coming back to, happened 2 years later, backstage at the Mercury Ballroom in Louisville on a homecoming show I'd been genuinely excited about. My father showed up at the stage door 40 minutes before doors, holding an old reel-to-reel tape box under his arm, and asked the security guard if he could get 5 minutes with me. My tour manager, a good protective woman named Deb, a different Deb, not my manager, I seem to collect them, came and found me and said there was a man at the door claiming to be my father with some kind of tape, and did I want him let back. I had 90 seconds before a sound check I was already late for, and I said, "Tell him it's not a good time, tell him I'll call him this week." I did not call him that week. I did not call him for several weeks after that. I never found out what was on the tape. I've wondered about it more times than I can count since the funeral, and I will never get to know. Because I made a specific, conscious decision at 28 years old, that whatever was in that box mattered less than being on time for a sound check, and I have to live with the fact that it might have been the whole explanation, offered to me directly, years before I would have accepted it anyway. The last real break came at my album release party for my second record, at a venue called the Basement East, 8 months after the magazine ran. My father came, uninvited by me, but invited by my brother, and stood near the back in a sport coat I recognized from every important occasion of my childhood, and when a label executive asked me, within earshot, who the older gentleman by the bar was, I said, "Oh, that's a family friend," and kept walking. I have never been able to satisfactorily explain to myself why I said family friend instead of any of the true things available to me in that sentence. He heard it. Someone told me later he heard it clearly, and that he left before the second song of my set, and that he didn't say anything to anyone on his way out, which somehow makes it worse than if he'd made a scene, because it meant he'd absorbed it the way he seemed to absorb everything, quietly, and gone home to a house I wasn't in. Eli called me the next morning, the one time in those 9 years he really tried to intervene directly, and asked me, flatly, whether I understood what I'd just done. I told him I'd been caught off guard, that it wasn't fair to read that much into one sentence at a loud party. And Eli said, "Joe, he stood by that bar for 40 minutes, hoping you'd introduce him properly, and you had one sentence to do it in, and you used it on something else, and I told him he was overreacting." And we didn't speak again for almost 4 months after that call. For the 9 years after that release party, my father and I spoke maybe a dozen times total, almost always initiated by him, almost always short. I told myself, and told Deb Halloran, and told the 2 or 3 friends who ever asked, that we'd simply grown apart, that this was a normal enough outcome for a family that had been split since I was 7. That plenty of people don't stay close to a parent who wasn't especially present to begin with. I built an entire professional identity in those 9 years around the story I'd already been telling, 3 albums, a sync placement in a car commercial that changed my finances permanently, a songwriting award from the local guild that I accepted with a speech about teaching myself everything from nothing, which got a standing ovation, and which my father, I found out later, watched a grainy upload of on his phone in the back room of his shop, alone, twice. In year 3 of the silence, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that my father had had what she called a little stroke. Minor, mostly resolved, nothing that changed his life much, and that Eli, my younger brother, who'd stayed close to him in a way I never had been the one to take him to the hospital and sit with him overnight. I heard this the way you hear weather in a city you don't live in anymore, something happening at a distance, to someone else's life, and it took me a full day to even register that the someone else was my father. I meant to call. I told myself I would call that weekend. I did not call that weekend, or the one after, and by the time enough time had passed that a call would have required an explanation for the delay, I let the delay become its own kind of permanent decision, the same way so many of my decisions about my father had become permanent simply by never being reversed. For 3 winters running, I spent the holidays exclusively with my mother and Greg at their house in a subdivision with a name like a golf resort, and told myself this was simply logistics, that my father's small apartment over the shop didn't have room for the kind of gathering we'd built, that it made more sense this way, and I said all of this in a tone of voice that made it sound like an unfortunate fact of geography rather than a preference I'd been building toward my entire adult life. I signed with a proper publishing house in year 4, a modest 6-figure advance against future royalties that felt, at the time, like proof I'd never needed anyone's help to get anywhere, and I called my mother and Greg that same afternoon before I called almost anyone else, including my own brother. In year 4, I bought a house in Berry Hill, the first property I'd ever owned outright, and I remember standing in the empty living room on closing day thinking, with real satisfaction, that I'd built this entirely without anyone's help. A thought I said out loud to Greg on the phone that same afternoon, and he told me he was proud of me for doing it the hard way. Without any of the complications, a phrase I understood at the time to mean without my father, and which I accepted as a compliment rather than examining as the small, specific dig it also was. For 3 winters running, I spent the holidays exclusively with my mother and Greg at their house in a subdivision with a name like a golf resort, and told myself this was simply logistics, that my father's small apartment over the shop didn't have room for the kind of gathering we'd built, that it made more sense this way, and I said all of this in a tone of voice that made it sound like an unfortunate fact of geography rather than a preference I'd been building toward my entire adult life. My father sent a card every one of those Decembers anyway, a plain one. Never anything elaborate, with a $20 bill folded inside and a line or two in his cramped, deliberate handwriting. Hope the record's coming along. Proud of you. Call when you get a minute. And I kept every single one of those cards in a drawer, without ever once calling when I got a minute, telling myself I'd respond properly once I had more time to actually talk. A version of more time that never once arrived across 9 consecutive years. In year 6, I was 2 hours from walking on stage at the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame dinner, seated at a table with people whose names had been on my childhood records, and somebody at the ceremony gave a speech about the unsung people behind the scenes of American music, the session players, the studio techs, the piano men nobody remembers. And I felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't examine closely, and during the cocktail hour I actually pulled up my father's number on my phone, thumb over the call button, for what felt like a long time and was probably closer to 2 minutes, and then Deb Halloran found me to say the car was here, and I put the phone away. And told myself I'd call him the next morning to tell him about the speech, about the feeling it had put in me, and I did not call him the next morning, or that week, or, as it turned out, ever, about that particular feeling. I got married in year 7, a small ceremony at a friend's property outside the city, and I didn't invite my father. I told myself, and told my now husband, that it was simpler this way, that introducing that particular complication on what was supposed to be an easy, happy day wasn't worth the logistics of seating charts and old resentments, and my husband, who has since told me he wishes he'd pushed back harder in that moment, mostly deferred to me, because it was, after all, my family and my history to manage. My father found out about the wedding secondhand, from Eli, 3 weeks after it happened, and sent a card, plain, like always, no bitterness in it that I could detect, congratulating me and saying he hoped to meet my husband sometime soon. We never did arrange that meeting. There was always, it turned out, something more urgent to schedule around it. The last time I saw him before the funeral was at my mother's 65th birthday, 18 months before he died, a stiff, brief encounter in a restaurant parking lot where he'd come to drop off Eli's kids and happened to arrive at the same time I did. We talked for maybe 4 minutes, about nothing, and he asked how the new record was coming, and I said fine, and he said good, that's good, and got back in a car that was, I noticed without letting myself dwell on it, newer and more reliable looking than the station wagons of my childhood. Though at the time I read that only as evidence that he'd finally, belatedly, gotten his finances in some kind of order, and not as the small, specific clue it actually was. He died on a Thursday in April, at home, of a heart attack, and wasn't found for 2 days, until a neighbor noticed his newspapers piling up on the step and called the building super. I got the call from Eli on a Saturday morning while I was in a writing session in Berry Hill, and I remember the specific, useless detail that stuck to me hardest in that first hour. That he'd been found still holding one of his tuning tools, a felt temperament strip, like he'd been in the middle of working on something when it happened, at 76 years old, alone on a Thursday, doing the one thing he'd done every day of his adult life. The funeral was arranged mostly by Eli and by a woman named Ruth Pemberton, who'd been the choir director and organist at First Baptist for almost 40 years, and who, it turned out, had known my father better in some ways than I had. I flew in Wednesday night and went to the church Thursday morning to help with programs, which is how I came to be standing in that vestibule, reading his full legal name in print for the first time in my life, Vincent Alden Danforth, and doing arithmetic I didn't want to be doing. The rest of the program was ordinary, the way these things always are, a photo from maybe 15 years earlier, a line about him being a beloved member of this congregation for over 3 decades, a note that in lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the music program at Bellwood Elementary, which I read 4 times without understanding. On the first 3 readings, that it wasn't a generic charitable suggestion someone had picked at random, but the precise, specific coordinates of a life I hadn't been paying attention to. I knew that name. Not from anywhere in my childhood. I genuinely never once heard my mother or anyone else use it. He was Al to everyone who'd ever known him. But from a composer credit I had read literally hundreds of times on a 45 I still owned, still kept in a frame in my own house in Nashville, the record that had undone me at 14 years old. R. Combs/V. Danforth. I stood in that vestibule with a stack of funeral programs in my hand and felt something go very still and very cold in my chest. The specific stillness of understanding you've been looking directly at something your whole life without ever actually seeing it. A woman I didn't recognize, an old parishioner probably, touched my elbow and said something kind about my father being a wonderful man, and I thanked her the way you thank strangers at funerals, on autopilot, while some other part of my brain kept turning over the same 4 words. R. Combs. V. Danforth. like a lock finally finding the right combination decades after I'd stopped trying any of the numbers. I found Ruth in the church kitchen, arranging trays of food that other people had dropped off, and I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether she knew anything about my father having a middle name that was actually his working name. Vincent, I said. Do you know why the program says Vincent? And Ruth set down the tray she was holding and looked at me for a long moment before she answered. She'd known my father for 38 years by then, longer than she'd known her own late husband, and she'd done his shop's taxes every March since Otis Renfro retired, which meant she likely understood more about the actual shape of his finances than my mother, my brother, or I ever had. He never told you, she said. It wasn't really a question. Told me what, Ruth? About Nashville, about the record. Before you were born, before any of this. She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the church, the whole life he'd built here. He wrote songs, Joe, real ones. He had a partner, a man named Randall Combs, and they wrote together for a few years down there before you came along. One of them did something with a singer named Wanda Shue. Carolina Lowe, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. That's the one, Ruth said, and studied my face like she was trying to decide how much more I could take standing up. You know it. I've known it since I was 14. Ruth went into the little office off the kitchen and came back with a shoebox, the kind of ordinary object that has no business carrying the weight it was about to carry, and set it on the counter between us. Inside were folded bank statements going back almost 20 years, small deposits, irregular, sometimes $40, sometimes closer to $300, from a royalty account tied to Bluegrass Line Records and clipped to a rubber-banded stack near the bottom, a series of canceled checks made out to Bellwood Elementary and to a scholarship fund at the arts camp I'd attended 2 summers running as a teenager, each one signed with the same name I'd just read on a funeral program for the first time. Ruth had written most of the memo lines herself, in her own careful hand, because his fingers had gotten stiff in the last several years and she'd offered to help him with the mailing, and she told me she'd asked him, more than once, whether he wanted her to just tell the school where the money was really coming from, and he'd always said no. That it wasn't the school's business, and it certainly wasn't mine, that the whole point of doing it this way was that nobody ever had to feel like they owed anybody anything for it. He set up something with the school, Ruth said, called it a community grant, so nobody would ask too many questions about where a piano tuner's money was coming from. I helped him mail the checks some years when his hands got bad. He never once told them who it was actually for. I don't think he ever told you it existed at all. I asked her, because I had to ask someone, whether she thought he'd meant for me to find any of this out. I think he meant for you to have the camp, Ruth said. I don't know that he ever meant for you to have the story behind it. He was a private man about that part of his life, Joe. I only know as much as I know, because I do his books at tax time every March, out of the goodness of my own retirement. I called Randall Combs that same afternoon, from the parking lot of the church, because Ruth had his number in an address book she still kept by the office phone, a real address book, paper, the kind almost nobody keeps anymore. He was 81, living outside Lexington, and he knew who I was before I finished introducing myself. You're Vince's girl, he said. The singer. I didn't know he wrote music, I said. I didn't know until this morning. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped, and I could hear, faintly, a television somewhere behind him. A game show. The ordinary sound of an old man's Tuesday afternoon going on around a conversation that was about to rearrange my entire understanding of my father. We wrote Carolina Lowe together, Combs finally said. Split everything down the middle on paper, back in '78. Wanda Shu's people restructured the contract a few years later after it did better than anyone expected, and by the time the money was real, my name was the only one still attached to the publishing. Vince could have fought it. He had a good case. A real one. He told me he had a baby daughter and a wife who wanted him home more than she wanted him in a courtroom, and he wasn't going to spend the next 3 years of your life arguing with a label over money instead of tuning pianos where he could actually see you grow up. So he let it go. All of it. I offered him a cut off the books more than once over the years, quietly, and he only ever took the smallest piece of it, said he didn't need much, said the rest could go toward something that mattered more. He never told me any of this. No, Combs said. I don't imagine he would have. That was Vince. He didn't want you carrying what it cost him. He wanted you thinking you'd built your whole life out of nothing but yourself, because he figured that story would set you free faster than the true one would. I asked Combs before we hung up whether he'd ever tried to talk my father out of it, back when the money would have mattered more, when I was small enough that a settlement might have changed the shape of our whole childhood. He said he had, once, over a diner breakfast in 1981, and that my father had let him make the entire argument, patiently, all the way through, and then said only one thing back to him: that he'd rather his daughter grow up thinking her father was nothing much at all than grow up watching him spend her whole childhood proving he'd once been something. I didn't understand that sentence for probably 30 years, Combs told me. I think I understand it now, talking to you. I asked him what the case would have looked like if my father had actually pursued it. Combs said their lawyer at the time, a man out of Nashville named Herb Lassiter, had told them both there was a strong argument for a full accounting of the publishing split, given the original 1978 contract language, and that a settlement in the low six figures wasn't out of the question if they'd been willing to spend 2 or 3 years in depositions and appeals to get it. 2 or 3 years, Combs repeated, like the numbers still bothered him 40 years later. You were what, 2 years old at the time? He did the math on what he'd be trading and decided the math wasn't close. I sat in that church parking lot for a long time after I hung up with Randall Combs, longer than I sat almost anywhere else that whole week, running back through 20 years of my own story about myself, self-taught, no formal training, built it from nothing, and understanding, piece by piece, how much of it had been quietly financed by a man I'd told a national magazine couldn't hold a job long enough to keep our own piano in tune. The camp. The lessons. Some portion of the calm, uneventful childhood I'd always credited entirely to my mother and Greg's steady orthodontist income, when in fact, a piece of it, a real piece, had been coming out of a royalty account for a song he never once mentioned owning, funneled through a made-up grant so that nobody, including me, would ever have to know whose generosity it actually was. I thought about the 8 bars he used to play on any piano in any room, the ones he never finished. Someday I'll finish that one, and understood, sitting in that parking lot, that I had spent my entire childhood assuming that unfinished melody was evidence of a man who couldn't follow through on anything, when it had actually been the sound of a man who'd finished something once, beautifully, and then made a documented, deliberate choice to walk away from finishing anything like it again, because finishing things in that particular business had a cost he wasn't willing to make his family pay. I thought about the tuning fork, tapped against his knee 1,000 times across my whole childhood, A440, the same pure, correct note every single time, no matter what room we were standing in. And I understood that for a man who spent his whole professional life restoring the correct pitch to instruments that had drifted, walking away from a life of public recognition to keep his own family in tune must have felt to him like the same job, just done on a larger and much more expensive instrument. I sat with that thought longer than any of the others, because it reframed something I'd always considered the flattest, dullest fact about him, that he did the same unglamorous work in the same 3-mile radius for 31 years without apparent ambition into something that looked, from this new angle, like the single most disciplined decision anyone in my family had ever made. I called my mother from the shop parking lot before I went home that night, mostly because I didn't know who else to call at 11 o'clock, and I told her what I'd learned: the song, the credit, the scholarship checks routed quietly through Ruth for over a decade. She was quiet on the line for a long time, longer than felt normal, and when she finally spoke, she said she'd known about the music. Some of it, from before they married, that he'd played her the record once, early on, and told her he was done with all of it, that he wanted a quiet life and a family, and didn't want the two of them spending their 20s fighting a label in court. She said she hadn't known about the scholarship money at all, not $1 of it, and that it had never once occurred to her. In 20 years of quietly resenting how little he seemed to contribute financially after the divorce, that some of what she was measuring him against had actually come from him the whole time, dressed up as somebody else's charity. She asked me at one point whether I thought she should have known, and I told her honestly that I didn't think it was hers to have found, any more than it was mine. That he'd built the whole arrangement specifically so that nobody close enough to feel guilty about it would ever have the chance to. I did some of this too, she said, which was the closest my mother has ever come, before or since, to an apology for her own part in how I learned to see him. I didn't press her further. Some conversations only have room for one honest sentence at a time. I thought, too, about the shop itself, about how many hours of my childhood I'd spent bored on that stool, resenting the free lessons and the free tunings, and the general shapelessness of a schedule that never seemed to prioritize the things I wanted prioritized, without ever once asking myself what it actually costs a man to build an entire professional life around customers who couldn't pay him, on top of a private, permanent decision to walk away from the one thing he'd ever done that the wider world might have recognized as remarkable. I used to describe him, to therapists, to boyfriends, to exactly one journalist in print, as a man who never seemed to want more for himself. I understand now that I had that backward in a way that should embarrass me more than it apparently did for over 2 decades. He wanted a great deal for himself. He simply decided once at a specific kitchen table in a specific year that what he wanted most wasn't going to come at the price of a courtroom and an absent decade of my childhood, and having made that decision, he never once revisited it out loud, not to make himself look good, not even to make himself look better to the daughter who spent her whole adult life describing him as somebody who'd simply never tried. I went to his shop that evening, alone, past the funeral home's business hours, using the spare key Eli had given me without asking why I wanted it. The shop hadn't been touched since he died. His tools were still laid out on the felt cloth on the workbench, mid-project, a small upright someone had dropped off the week before, waiting for a repair he never got to finish. The bell over the door still stuck the way it always had before it rang, a detail I hadn't thought about in 30 years, and that undid me more, standing there in the dark, than almost anything Ruth or Combs had told me that day. I sat down at that piano in the dark, in a shop that smelled like felt and machine oil and 31 years of other people's instruments, and I played the 8 bars I'd heard him play my entire life, from memory, note for note. And then, for the first time in either of our lives, I kept going past where he always stopped. I don't know if what I played after that was actually the song he'd have written, or just a shape my own hands made up out of grief and 45 years of half attention. It doesn't matter. I said some things out loud in that empty shop that I'm not going to try to reconstruct exactly, because they weren't eloquent. They were short and plain and came out of me in pieces. I called you useless. I said it in print. I said it to a room full of strangers with your own name on a program in my hand, and you knew. You knew the whole time exactly what you were and what you'd given up, and you let me keep thinking you were nothing, because you'd decided that was cheaper for me than the truth. I sat at that piano for a long time after I ran out of words, in a dark shop, talking to a man who wasn't there to hear any of it, which is its own particular kind of punishment, the kind you don't get a chance to serve until it's already too late to matter to the person who deserved to hear it. I also had, eventually, a conversation with Greg, which I'd put off longer than any of the others, because I understood by then that some of what I'd learned to feel about my father had been shaped in his house, at his table, in a tone I'd copied without ever being explicitly told to. I don't accuse him of anything. I mostly just told him what I'd found, the same way I'd told my mother, and watched his face do something complicated that I chose not to interpret too specifically. He said, eventually, that he'd never meant for me to think less of my father, that he'd only ever wanted me to feel settled in the family we actually had, and I believe that's true, as far as it goes. The same way my own reasoning about the magazine quote or the release party had been true as far as it went, which is to say true enough to survive scrutiny and still not the whole honest shape of the thing. There is no version of this where I get to apologize to him and watch him accept it, and I've had to make a kind of peace with the fact that the format of my particular story doesn't allow for that scene, no matter how many times I've written it in my head. What I got instead, in the months after the funeral, was Eli, who was civil to me at the service and for a long while after that was not much more than civil, which I understood I had earned and did not try to argue my way out of. I asked him, about 6 weeks after the funeral, if I could see the rest of what Dad had kept, not to publicize any of it, I told him, just to understand, and Eli said he'd think about it. And it took him another 2 months to actually call me back and say yes, on the condition, his condition, not mine, that whatever I found stayed inside the family, that I wasn't going to turn our father's quiet life into a chapter of my own comeback story for some magazine profile. I agreed to that, and I've kept the agreement, which is part of why I'm telling this to you now with different names for the church and the label, because some of what belonged to him is still not mine to spend the way I've spent so much else that used to belong to him. I agreed to that, and I've kept the agreement, which is part of why I'm telling this to you now with different names for the church and the label, because some of what belonged to him is still not mine to spend the way I've spent so much else that used to belong to him. Eli let me back into the apartment above the shop about 4 months after the funeral, on a Sunday afternoon, and we went through the rest of it together, a filing cabinet of 30 years of tax records that Ruth had mostly already sorted, a closet of dress shirts still in dry cleaning bags, a shoebox, separate from Ruth's, of ticket stubs from shows he'd apparently gone to alone over the years. Mine among them, more of mine than I would have guessed, going back further than I would have guessed, including a small club show in Nashville in a year I hadn't even known he'd been in the state. Eli didn't say much while we went through it. At one point he handed me a ticket stub without comment from a show 11 years earlier, one of the first paying gigs I ever played, and I understood, holding it, that he'd been there, in some back corner of some room I never scanned closely enough to notice him, more than once. Possibly more times than I'll ever have an accurate count of. Because he never once told me, and never once asked to be let backstage. I did go back to Randall Combs once more, a few months later, not for anything to do with my own career, but to ask if there was a way to make sure the songwriting credit finally reflected what had actually happened in 1978. Combs, to his credit, didn't fight me on it. He said he'd been carrying his own version of this particular regret for over 40 years and had simply never had anyone to hand it back to. We amended the credit through the publisher quietly, with no announcement, no press release. Nothing that made its way into any interview I've given since, because the point was never to get anything out of it. My father didn't do what he did so that his daughter could eventually stand somewhere and be given credit for setting the record straight. The correction exists now in a database somewhere that almost nobody will ever look at, which is, I've come to think, exactly the scale he'd have wanted it kept at. I finished tuning that upright in the shop myself, badly, with Eli standing over my shoulder correcting me twice. The small repair job Dad never got to close out, and we gave it, finished, to Bellwood Elementary, the same music room he'd tuned for free for over 20 years. No plaque, no ceremony, just a delivery truck and a note from the Danforth family that didn't specify which one of us had actually done the work. The school principal called afterward to say thank you and to ask, gently, whether we wanted any public acknowledgement of the gift at the spring concert, and Eli, without even looking at me for input, said no, that wasn't necessary. That our father had never once wanted anything like that in 20 years and we weren't going to start now on his behalf. I agreed with him immediately, and meant it, in a way that felt different from all the other times in my life I'd agreed with someone quickly, just to keep the peace. I kept his tuning fork. It sits on my own piano now, in Nashville, and some mornings, before I write anything, I tap it against my knee out of a habit I only picked up after he was gone, and I play those same 8 bars, and most days I still stop exactly where he always stopped. Because it turns out some things you don't get to finish just because you finally understand why they were left open. Once or twice a year, usually late at night, I get further than 8 bars. And whatever comes out after that never sounds finished either, and I've stopped expecting it to. I don't think that melody was ever actually about being completed. I think it was about a man who wanted every single day of his working life to sit down at an instrument and prove to himself he could still make something true. In the 2 or 3 minutes before the next customer walked in and needed something fixed. Eli and I talk most weeks now, not every week, and not always easily. There are 9 years between us that don't close just because I finally learned the right facts. He still, gently, corrects me when I get some detail about our father wrong, which happens more often than I'd like, because I spent so long not paying attention that I have an entire childhood's worth of catching up to do. He told me a few months ago that he didn't need me to feel guilty forever, that guilt wasn't actually useful to him or to Dad's memory, but that he did need me to keep showing up to the small, unglamorous things, a nephew's recital, a Sunday dinner, a phone call that isn't about anything, the way our father apparently always had, quietly, without needing credit for it. I'm trying. I don't always get it right. Last month, I missed his daughter's school play because of a booking I could technically have moved, and I heard myself, on the phone with Eli afterward, starting to build the exact kind of reasonable-sounding excuse I used to build for 9 straight years, and I stopped myself halfway through the sentence out loud and said, "No, that's not actually why." I just didn't prioritize it, and Eli was quiet for a second and then said that was probably the most honest thing I'd said to him since the funeral. I think that might be the most honest thing I can tell you about where this actually stands. If there's one thing I'd want someone else to take from this, it's simple, and I don't think it needs any dressing up. The people we call useless are sometimes just the people who decided, quietly and at real cost to themselves, that being useful to us mattered more than being understood by us. You don't find that out by asking once. You find it out by staying close enough, long enough, to actually listen for it. the way my father listened for a single string drifting out of true in a room full of noise. I didn't. I had 45 years, and I used almost none of them, and the only honest thing I can offer anyone hearing this is, don't wait for an obituary to teach you your own father's real name. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.